Today, most kids experience racing through screens, controllers, and video games. In the 1960s and 70s, racing meant building a track on the living room floor, gripping a tiny controller, and watching miniature cars scream around the corners. Imagine spending an entire afternoon assembling a track, choosing your favorite car, challenging a friend, and trying to stay on the throttle just a little longer. Not for points on a screen, but to see your tiny car actually cross the finish line first. For almost 20 years, that afternoon repeated itself in millions of American homes. It happened in finished basements and unfinished ones, on braided rugs in front of the television, on card tables set up in garages that still smelled like fresh-cut lumber. It happened at a scale so small you could hold a car between two fingers, and yet it felt, to the kid holding the controller, like the biggest thing in the world. The company behind most of it was called Aurora, and for a while, before video games existed as anything more than a curiosity in a university lab, Aurora slot cars were as close as an American kid could get to the feeling of driving. This is the story of how that happened and why, by the early 1980s, it had quietly stopped. Aurora Plastics Corporation didn't start out making race cars. It started out in Brooklyn, New York, founded in 1950 by an engineer named Joseph Giammarino, building plastic model kits, airplanes, ships, later the monster kits that would make the company famous with an entire generation of hobbyists. Plastic was still a fairly new material for toys in the early 1950s, and Aurora built its name on kits kids could glue together themselves. Slot cars entered the picture almost by accident. In 1960, in a London toy fair, a British company called Playcraft was showing off a new kind of electric racing set, small cars that ran in grooved slots on a plastic track powered by a wire under the surface. Aurora's representatives saw it and understood immediately what American kids would do with it. They bought the US marketing rights on the spot. That single decision, made in a London exhibition hall, would end up shaping how an entire generation of American children spent their evenings. Aurora rushed the sets into American stores in time for the 1960 Christmas season under the name Model Motoring. The cars ran on AC power and buzzed as they moved. Collectors would later nickname them vibrators because that hum was part of the experience, a small mechanical shiver you could feel through the floor if you put your hand near the track. Picture the scene in a living room that December. Wrapping papers still scattered on the carpet, a father on his knees connecting a length of orange plastic track to another, a mother reading the small print on the instruction sheet because nobody had thought to read it before opening the box. The transformer hummed. Somewhere, a car buzzed forward, wobbled at the first curve, and flew off the track into the leg of the coffee table. Nobody minded. That was part of it too. By the time the sets went on clearance in January, hobby shop owners already knew they'd need to reorder for next Christmas. Model motoring had become, almost overnight, one of the most requested toys in the country. Every town of any size seemed to have one. A hobby shop with a bell over the door, a glass counter with model kits stacked behind it, and in the back, a demonstration track running almost continuously during business hours. Kids pressed their faces to the glass case holding replacement parts, tiny guide pins, brushes, armatures, the way other kids might look at penny candy. The shop owner usually knew every regular by name. He'd know whose Thunderjet kept jumping the corner on lane 3, whose mother had just bought him his first controller, who was saving up allowance money for the next body shell. These shops became a kind of unofficial clubhouse. A kid could walk in on a Saturday afternoon, spend 20 minutes just watching somebody else's car lap the demo track, and walk out without buying anything, and still leave feeling like he'd been somewhere important. By 1963, Aurora had replaced the buzzing AC-powered cars with something faster and quieter, the Thunderjet 500, a car with its motor mounted flat, a pancake motor that ran on direct current and gripped the track with real authority for the first time. Word passed from kid to kid at school faster than any advertisement could manage. You didn't just have a slot car set anymore, you had a Thunderjet. In basements across the country, tracks started growing. What began as a simple oval on a sheet of plywood became a 2-lane figure 8, then a 4-lane monster with hand-painted guardrails and a scoreboard nailed to the wall. Fathers who hadn't touched a soldering iron since the war found themselves wiring transformers and running extension cords along floor joists. Older brothers home from a paper route would disappear downstairs for hours, and the only sound coming up through the floor register was the whine of motors and, every so often, a triumphant shout when somebody finally beat the track record. By 1965, Aurora had sold more than 25 million HO-scale slot cars. It's a number that's hard to picture until you consider that it meant nearly every neighborhood in America had at least one house with a track set up somewhere, and that house became the house everyone wanted to be invited to after school. For a lot of families, the whole thing started months before Christmas with a catalog. The Sears Wishbook arrived in the mail every fall, thick as a phone book, and kids would fight over who got to look at it first. Slot car sets got 2 full pages some years, glossy photographs of a track laid out in an impossible sprawling loop, cars frozen mid-corner, the kind of layout no actual living room could hold. Kids circled the page in pencil, or folded the corner down, or simply left the catalog open on the kitchen table where a parent couldn't help but see it. Saturday mornings didn't help the cause either. Between cartoons, Aurora ran commercials built to make a 9-year-old's chest tighten with wanting, cars roaring around a banked curve, an announcer's voice promising speed and power that no wire-guided, buzzing toy could technically deliver. But that didn't matter. By the time the ad ended and the cartoon came back on, half the kids watching had already decided what they wanted written on their birthday list. Slot cars had a strange way of following kids out of the house and into the schoolyard. Recess conversations weren't only about baseball cards or bicycles anymore. They were about lap times, about whose car had Magna-Traction, a phrase most third graders couldn't have defined but every one of them wanted, about whose older cousin had built a track so long it took up an entire garage. There was a particular kind of status that came with owning the right car. A kid with a Chaparral or a Mako Shark body shell in his lunchbox pocket had something to trade, something to talk about, something that made him briefly interesting to kids who otherwise had no reason to notice him. It wasn't really about the car. It was about having a story to tell before the bell rang. Not every parent loved it. Slot car tracks took up space, and space in a 1960s American home was not unlimited. There are countless family stories, never quite the same twice, but always recognizable, about a track that colonized the dining room table for 6 weeks straight, or a mother who insisted the plywood monstrosity be broken down every Sunday for company, only to have it rebuilt by Tuesday because nobody had the heart to leave it in pieces. The noise mattered too. A 4-lane track with 4 kids racing at once produced a genuine racket. Buzzing motors, clattering cars flying off the rails, arguments over whose lane had better traction. More than one father, tired after a long shift, hollered down the basement stairs to turn it down. And more than one of those same fathers was found an hour later kneeling by the track with a controller in his hand, insisting he was just checking the wiring. That contradiction, the noise that annoyed and the pull that nobody, including the adults, could quite resist, is part of what made these tracks feel like more than toys. They were gathering places. They pulled whole families toward the same patch of carpet on a Saturday night. By 1971, Aurora retired the old model motoring name and introduced something new, AFX, short for Aurora Factory Experimentals. The AFX cars used interchangeable body shells that snapped onto a shared chassis, which meant a kid could own one fast car and swap the body, a Corvette one week, a Trans Am the next, without buying a whole new set of electronics. It was a small design decision that turned out to matter enormously because it meant the hobby could keep growing without asking parents to keep buying entire new track systems. Then, in the mid-1970s, came Magna-Traction, small magnets built into the chassis that pulled the car down against the metal rails in the track, letting it take corners at speeds that would have sent the old Thunderjets flying. Kids who had grown up on the old cars still talk about the first time they ran a Magna-Traction car on a curve they knew by heart, expecting the usual fishtail and spin, and watching the car simply hold the line instead. It felt, for a 9 or 10-year-old in 1975, like the future had arrived in a small plastic box. By the mid-1970s, a secondary economy had quietly built itself around the hobby. Kids traded loose cars the way earlier generations traded marbles, a chipped-up Mustang for a slightly better-conditioned Javelin, a spare guide pen thrown in to sweeten the deal. Some of this happened on porches after school. Some of it happened in the back pages of hobby magazines parents barely glanced at, where classified ads offered rare body shells for a few dollars plus postage. There was an etiquette to it, unspoken but strictly enforced. You didn't trade away your only working car. You didn't lowball a kid who was clearly desperate to complete a set. And you absolutely did not let a younger sibling anywhere near the negotiation, because younger siblings had a well-documented habit of agreeing to terrible deals just to feel included. What was happening in American living rooms was also happening, less visibly, in corporate offices far from any hobby shop. Aurora's founders had retired by the late 1960s, and the company passed through a series of new owners. First, a group of outside investors in 1969, then the food conglomerate Nabisco in 1971. It was part of a broader pattern of the era, large companies buying up toy and hobby makers as a way to diversify, often without much feel for the hobby itself. The 1973 oil crisis made plastic, the raw material for every car body, every chassis, every foot of track, significantly more expensive almost overnight. A company already juggling new ownership now had to absorb rising production costs on a product line that depended entirely on cheap, plentiful plastic. Around the same time, competitors like Tyco began pushing a larger 1:64 scale with simpler, easier-to-repair motors, forcing Aurora to spend money answering a rival instead of simply enjoying the market it had essentially invented. None of this was visible from a kid's eye view. A 10-year-old racing his AFX cars in 1976 had no idea that the company making them was losing money, changing leadership, and being managed by executives whose real expertise was in cookies and crackers, not injection-molded plastic. But those boardroom decisions were, slowly, setting the terms for how long the toy in his hands would keep being made. There's a pattern worth naming here, because it wasn't unique to Aurora. Across the toy industry in these years, family-founded companies with a genuine feel for their product kept getting absorbed into much larger conglomerates chasing diversification, food companies, tobacco companies, consumer goods giants who saw toys as just another shelf of merchandise to manage. The people who understood why a kid loved a Thunderjet weren't always the people making decisions about its production budget anymore. That gap between the people who built the affection for a product and the people who controlled its future shows up again and again in the story of toys that disappeared during this era, and Aurora's slot cars were far from the only casualty of it. But here's the part people rarely talk about when they tell the Aurora story. The thing that ultimately pulled kids away from the slot car table wasn't a better slot car, it was a different kind of screen. Through the early and mid-1970s, arcades began filling with games like Pong, and by 1977, home television sets could plug into consoles like the Atari 2600. These new machines offered something a slot car track never could, a race that reset itself instantly, that didn't require rewiring a transformer or repainting a chipped body shell, that fit in a box the size of a shoebox instead of taking over half a basement. It's tempting to call this simple technological replacement. Old toy loses to new toy, but the people who lived through it remember it as something quieter and sadder than that. A slot car track demanded a kind of patience and shared labor that a video game simply didn't. You built it together, you fixed it together, hunting for a stripped gear or a dead brush with a magnifying glass and a look of real concentration. A video game asked for none of that. You turned it on, and it worked, alone, in your own hands, with nobody required to hold the other controller unless you wanted them there. Something in the culture shifted along with the toy. The garage workbench, the basement floor covered in orange track, the ritual of a father teaching a son how to solder a broken wire. These didn't disappear overnight, but they stopped being the default. A whole texture of childhood, built around doing something together with your hands, quietly gave way to something you could do perfectly well by yourself. There was also a kind of shared failure that slot car racing taught, almost by accident, that a video game never had to. When your car flew off the track, you crawled across the carpet to retrieve it, in full view of whoever you were racing. There was no pause menu, no restart screen to hide the moment behind. You picked the car up, set it back on the rails, and kept going, while the kid across the table either razzed you about it or, just as often, reached over to help you find the wheel that had popped loose under the couch. That small, physical, slightly humiliating ritual of losing in front of somebody and getting back up anyway quietly disappeared along with the tracks themselves. Aurora itself didn't survive to see how the story ended. Nabisco sold off the model kit division to rival Monogram in 1977, closing out that side of the business entirely. The slot car line under the AFX name kept going a little longer under different ownership, still selling to a shrinking but loyal group of enthusiasts, but by 1983, the company behind it had been forced into receivership. 3 years later, in 1986, the Japanese toy company Tomy bought what remained of the AFX brand and kept a version of it alive for collectors and diehards. The tracks didn't vanish from American homes all at once. In plenty of houses, the plywood board stayed exactly where it had always been, folded up behind the water heater or shoved under a bed for years after anyone had last flipped the transformer switch. Eventually, most of them were given away at a yard sale or hauled to the curb during a move, usually without much ceremony. A hobby that had once filled entire Saturdays quietly became a box of plastic cars in an attic, waiting for nobody in particular. What's interesting is what happened after that. Slot cars never came roaring back into mainstream American childhood the way, say, board games occasionally do, but they didn't die out completely either. A dedicated core of collectors kept the hobby alive through the 1980s and 1990s, buying up old AFX and Thunderjet cars at swap meets, restoring tracks in their own basements now as adults instead of kids, chasing the same feeling they remembered from decades earlier. Companies like Tomy and later smaller specialty manufacturers kept producing HO-scale cars for that shrinking but devoted audience, even after Aurora itself had ceased to exist as a company in any meaningful sense. It became, in other words, a hobby that outlived the corporation that invented it, kept going not by executives chasing a market, but by the people who simply refused to let it go. There's an obvious comparison to make here, and it's worth resisting the urge to be too tidy about it. Video games are not the villain of this story, and slot cars were not some purer, nobler form of childhood entertainment. Both are, in the end, machines built to give a kid the sensation of speed he couldn't otherwise have. But there is a real difference in what each one asked of a family. A slot car track needed floor space, cooperation, and repair. It needed somebody to help find the right screwdriver, somebody to hold the flashlight while a stripped gear got replaced, somebody willing to lose gracefully when their car flew off the third turn for the 5th time in a row. A video game needed an outlet, and eventually not much else. Neither convenience nor connection is automatically the better trade, but it's fair to say something was lost in the shift from a hobby that lived in shared physical space to one that increasingly lived inside a screen a kid could carry into his own room and shut the door. If you had a model motoring set, a Thunderjet, or an AFX track with Magna-Traction cars flying off the third turn, you already know exactly what that orange plastic smelled like when you opened the box. Tell us where your track was set up. The basement, the garage, the living room floor your mother eventually banned you from racing on. Tell us which car was your favorite and whether you still remember the sound that little motor made right before it left the rails. We'd love to hear it.